I'm here with my friend Laura Jeppesen. She's not actually here. You don't want to know where she is, but she deserves it. Laura's an old friend and somebody who has, as far as I know, plays now in or has played in just about every early music ensemble in the Boston area and far beyond. She's a kind of a musical institution around these parts, and it's a pleasure to have a chance to chat with her. She plays the viola da gamba, and she plays all sorts of stringed instruments, viola, viol, many other things, including ones whose names I don't even know. Anyway, Laura, I am delighted to see you. Well, welcome to our little group.
Thank you, Tom. Nice to talk to you.
Thanks. Laura, we're sort of interested in sort of the history of the historical performance movement in North America and so forth, of which you're a significant part. But can you tell us just personally, how did you get going on music, and when did you first discover early music, and what did you do?
You're frozen. Well, I'll talk anyway, but your face is frozen. Okay. So I grew up in a small New England college town. My father was a professor of physics at Bowdoin College. And my earliest memories, almost all of them, have something to do with music. I know that growing up, my first two big loves were playing the violin and learning French. And I owe a lot to my mother for helping me develop these interests. My mother grew up speaking French. She was French Canadian, and she was also a grammarian. She always corrected our grammar at home. I'm the youngest of four. I have three older sisters. So playing the violin and learning French was one way I could distinguish myself from my older sisters. You know, we had a beautiful figure skater, we had a literary person, we had a mathematician, but I was musician. And it was in early teen years that I developed a passion for French culture. And my mother found a French teacher for me in Brunswick, Maine. Madame Leblanc was the wife of the high school French teacher, and she was from Versailles. And she made me think about France like a magic kingdom. She would tell me about the smell of the orange blossoms, and her mother would grind the coffee in their garden at Versailles, not at the castle, but in the town of Versailles. And I just knew that I had to go to France. She also taught me récitation. To this day, I can go on and on with poems, Baudelaire, Verlaine, La Fontaine. I learned poetry with her that it's like melodies for me now, like pieces of music that you learn young and you never forget. So that was the French component. I was so determined to live in France that my mother, in desperation, went to the dean of students at Bowdoin and said, might there be a French student here? And there was. Régis Dognan. My mother wrote to Madame Dognan, introduced herself and said, if we pay you room and board, would you take our daughter for a year? So that was when I was 16. I set off for France by myself. And in those days, do I have to tell you what that was? It was 1963. And I took the boat. In those days, it wasn't just taken for granted that you would fly. And I remember my parents getting on the boat to see me off with my trunk, the grand tour. And all I could think of was, get off the boat. I remember looking at the expanse of ocean and feeling the thrill of my life. So that's the French component. I lived with a French family, very bourgeois family. They said "vous" to me the whole year. But I went to the Lycée de Sèvres. I walked down these little streets where there were women all in black, the old ladies with their market baskets. And I thought, oh my gosh, there are so many worlds within our world. It was a real education for me. And we were in Sèvres, right between Paris and Versailles. And every weekend I went into Paris. I went to the Jeu de Paume a lot. That's when the Impressionists were then housed at the Jeu de Paume. And I could not pass a bookstore without buying a livre de poche. I read Balzac and everything I could get my hands on. So that's the French component. I had already discovered the violin back home. In fact, it was when my father was on sabbatical at Berkeley, when I was in 5th grade, that I began violin lessons. And I began violin lessons with an elderly lady whose teacher, get this, was Leopold Auer.
Wow.
Now, does that date me? I cannot believe that.
That takes you back a long way in a hurry,
very
doesn't
long
it?
time. And she recognized that I had talent and told my mother if she would bring me twice a week, every other lesson would be free. So I had a really good start on the violin. But then that year in France, I didn't take the initiative to find a teacher, and I really didn't play. But when I came back from France, rather than go back to Brunswick, my father was then, he had a year with the National Science Foundation in Washington. So I went to do my last year of high school in Washington. And there I fell in love with the violin all over again. My teacher was this gorgeous Italian guy. I mean, I fell in love with him too. I've never quite been able to separate the violin from romance, I have to say. More about that later.
You happen to be married to a violinist, I think.
Yes.
But not the handsome Italian guy, a different handsome guy. Anyway, go on.
Raymond Montoni was my teacher, and he would come from Pennsylvania to spend the weekend at the home of one of his students, and that's where we would all congregate. So all of my friends were violin students of Ray Montoni that year. I played Beethoven F major Romance. What could be more appropriate? So shall we zoom ahead a little bit? It was always French or music. And ultimately, it was music that won out. And I ended up going to Yale for a master's degree in violin. And there were 4 of us in our class, and one of them was Dan Stepner. Very nice coincidence. So he was my boyfriend. And let's see, how did it happen here? These were the days, this was 1970, the days when New Haven was full of National Guard. It was the scene of the Bobby Seale trial. These were the days when we were hearing words like women's liberation, natural foods, tie-dye, macrame. For the first time, we were hearing these words. And we were not only thinking in terms of, is it appropriate to play early instruments? Looking backward, we weren't thinking that. We were thinking, is it relevant to music at all?
Right.
We had political meetings at the School of Music at Yale debating these topics, and going home to my apartment, the National Guard was sometimes lining High Street. Well, it was decided in some of these meetings that we would throw out the curriculum. I don't know if you remember that Kingman Brewster actually opened Yale to the Vietnam protesters.
Right.
Whereas Harvard had closed down and there'd been a lot of trouble. So New Haven was abuzz with protesting. And it was decided in the School of Music that we would do away with the old way of doing business, that each student would decide what their professional goals were and choose 3 faculty members to be their advisors. And I remember going to the library and I took out a piece of paper, I drew a line down the middle. On the left was, what do I like to do? And on the right was, what don't I like to do?
Huh.
At the top of what I like to do, I like to play music. I like to study history. At the top of what I don't like to do was, I don't like to play in an orchestra. I don't like to take somebody else's fingerings and interpretations of all the standard concerti that I'll never play as well as the records that I have in my collection. And I chose for my advisors Lehman Perkins, Brodus Earl, my teacher, violin teacher, and Yehudi Weiner. And those 3 were just fabulous. And
well, a distinguished musicologist and a distinguished composer, in case people don't know who those people are, Lehman Perkins and Yehudi, yeah.
And that led me one day to the Yale collection of instruments. I guess Lehman was then working on the Melon Chansonnier, I think. He gave me some music and he said, see if you can play this on the viola da gamba. I said, the viola da what? So I went to the collection. Richard Rapin was then the curator, and he sat me down with a Siciliano gamba. The first gamba I ever played was circa 1600. Mm-hmm. I spent the day there and I just fell in love with the whole idea. I thought, now I can make a contribution. Now there's a future for me in music and for everything I love. And at the end of the day, Dan and I both remember this. I went looking for my boyfriend who was, guess what, practicing. And I said, Dan, I'm going to be a gambist. He said, what? Okay, that's the story of how I met the gamba. Then I went to John Shu's workshop this summer in Ithaca at Cornell. And let's see if I can tell you some of the people who were there. My friend Sarah, of course, Sarah Cunningham. Barbara Muser, remember her? Mm-hmm. Carol Herman? No, that's from somewhere else. Wait. Freddie Arrico, Ben Harms, Lucy Bardot, Marianne Ballard, Martha Bishop, Peter Turin,
wow,
Richard Taruskin, Lex Silberger, Jan Lyman, all of those people.
It's a good thing nobody dropped a bomb on that particular, that would have been the end of the gamba in North America, just about.
Yes, right. And then in New Haven, I took lessons from Grace Feldman at the Neighborhood Music School. I went to New York to take some lessons with Judy Davidoff. And I had some lessons in Boston with Jan Lyman. I just went to everyone I could. Then, after John Shu's workshop, I asked Yale if I could take a semester from my studies to study at Cornell with him. And they gave me credit for doing that. So I ended up getting my master's in a hybrid degree. It was really early music. I gave, actually, I don't want to hear it, but I gave gamba recital at the collection for my degree recital. So then I needed to go to Europe. I had heard Wieland, the hilarious ensemble, came to Yale to the collection. And that concert just blew me away. And afterwards I went to Wieland and I said, "Do you have students?" And he said, "Only bad ones." So I wanted to go to Europe to study with him. And I went to the Yale office where they had these catalogs of grants. And I looked up Fulbrights and I saw that they only gave 4 Fulbrights to Belgium. And I thought, I'll never get one of 4. So I've got to find another country to go to. Well, they gave 71 to Germany. So I thought, okay, I'm going to make the case that I need to go to Germany. Well, I had heard about Johannes Koch when I had been at that workshop. I think it was Ben Harms and Lucy Bardo who told me about Johannes Koch in Hamburg. So I made the case in my application that I needed to study with him, full well knowing I just had to get across the pond and get to Wieland as soon as I could. It worked. I spent a year in Hamburg. Now, Johannes Koch is really from the Wenzinger School, which was not the school of playing that I wanted and ended up with, but it was very useful information for me. And I went from there. I asked the Fulbright people, is there a grant that maybe I could apply to study in Belgium? And they told me that the Belgian Ministry of Culture gave grants that were renewable. So I ended up then, after my year in Hamburg, going to Belgium and studying with Wieland for 2 years on that renewable grant. Those were the days when we could get grants. So I lived in a farmhouse in just a couple blocks away from Wieland. And that was a clearinghouse for everybody who was studying there. Jean Lamont, Sarah, Jane Hershey were regular guests on weekends. The Stella Artois arrived in a big case. I lived in this cobblestone nook, and I had a little VW, and they called them the peasants. The peasants lived next door. It was a little farmhouse. And they would collect the betterave or the potatoes, and I would drive my VW behind their truck, and over the cobblestone roads, those potatoes would fall, and I would open the car door and pick them up and wait very well on the produce from my neighbor. And we got milk in a little green jug from the cows next door. And we studied with Wieland, which set me up for life. Am I getting into too much detail here?
Oh, this is great. So that's marvelous. And then you came back to America, and it must have seemed a very different world. And it was a world that wasn't full of early music ensembles and people begging you to play for them. I mean, how did you go about making a career for yourself when you came back?
Well, my relationship with Dan was continuing all this time. And in order to see each other, we began to play at the Monadnock Festival in the summer. So I would go from Belgium for the summer at Monadnock, and then we met John Gibbons. So right away, when I came back, I was still studying in Belgium when we met John, and we started to play together immediately. And it was only a couple years later that then we took the name, the Boston Museum Trio.
I don't know how you got to be. Was it through the instrument collection that you were associated with the museum?
Yes, because John was then keeper of the harpsichords, I think they called him at that point. So it was John's connection to the museum. So when I did come back to Belgium, it was to marry Dan. And John and Carol, remember Carol Bozet, the wonderful artist?
I certainly do.
A very close friend.
Yeah.
We lived together for 2 years in a Federalist house in Charlestown. And so it was at that time, Barbara Lambert was our neighbor. She was the curator of the instruments at the Museum of Fine Arts. So that was our other connection with the museum. And it was Barbara who encouraged us to find a name so she could promote us. So we thought of the Boston Symphony, but that was taken. So we ended up the Boston Museum Trio. And that was really my mainstay group for 35 years, even though I was also playing in other groups. And all three of us were members of the Orchestra of the 18th Century with Franz Bruggen. I had made a lot of those contacts when I lived in Belgium. I had played with La Petite Bande, with Sigiswald. And so we knew Franz already, and Leonhardt too. I have some nice stories, but maybe it's off the track. I won't go there.
So you played what? You played viola in those bands?
Yes.
No.
So I found a viola while I was studying at the conservatory in Brussels. An Iranian student came up to me one day and said, do you know anyone who would like to buy a viola? And I said, may I look at it? And it was a beautiful 18th century viola, anonymous. The front and the back were made by 2 different people, and it had been 2 different very large violas. And I took that viola to Fred Lindemann, who was doing all of the restoration in Amsterdam at that time. And he fitted it out as a Baroque viola. And that's the instrument that I play to this day. It has never given me a moment problem, never opened any seam or anything. It's a beautiful Baroque viola.
Great.
So I was lucky to find that and to be in the place where I could get a good restoration. So yes, I was playing viola in La Petite Bande.
Yeah. And I've seen you do a bunch of viola playing around Boston and elsewhere, so that you've sort of combined, well, not just these 2 things, but many other things, but the gamba as a solo player and the viola as an ensemble player, essentially, for many years now, right?
Yes, I like to say I'm not a violist, but I play viola.
Well, there's a joke in that, but let's not.
Yeah, we won't go there.
Yeah, well, that's great. The Dan Steppner you mentioned was for many years the concertmaster of the Handel and Haydn Society Orchestra in Boston. You played with that band a certain amount too. You still do,
Christopher Hogwood came, that's when I joined H&H. And then Dan and I were founding members of Boston Baroque.
Right.
We were classmates of Marty Perlman at Yale. And actually, when we got to Yale, Bill Christie was still there. So we knew Bill and played with him at Yale. So my activities in Boston, as you said, all the Boston groups, the Boston Early Music Festival, I have played in every festival from the very beginning, except for one, and that's when the King's Noise was the orchestra one
Right.
year with Andrew Parrott. That's the only summer I didn't play in the orchestra, and I'm still active with BEMF. And
Sure.
I've watched BEMF grow, which has been amazing.
It is amazing, isn't it? It was
Yes.
such a, well, think of other things too, things that began as amateur things like not all things that you were part of, but the Boston Camerata, or like
Oh,
the
yes.
Boston Early Music Festival was just a bunch of well-intentioned people saying, hey, kids, let's put on a festival and see what happens, and so
Yes.
on. What's interesting to me, Laura, is that essentially every name you've named is somebody known to me and somebody who has been really important in early music in North America. But what it also means is that the numbers of people back in those days, whenever that was, the 1970s, say, was really very limited. There were not so many people. And a lot of people I know, including you, spent a lot of time on the Amtrak, going back and forth and playing sort of all the gigs there were, because
Yes.
for certain instruments and certain kinds of things, you had to schedule it when they weren't playing the same thing in Boston and so on.
Exactly. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And I remember the days when I thought I knew every player in the world,
Mhm.
not just Boston or the United States. And of course, that's totally impossible now.
Well, it is impossible now. The world has changed a lot, but it's owing, I think, to the hard work of people who were, well, at that time, trying to figure it out. I mean, I had a conversation with Marty Perlman, and he was saying we had a lot of times when we were just trying to decide how it ought to work, how the instruments work, how many there should be, how to play in tune, if at all possible, and so on. Things
Yeah.
that people don't think about anymore.
Yeah, I have this vague memory of ordering gut strings from a company called Will's Company, I think in Chicago,
Mhm.
and they sold surgical gut. So we just bought all the gauges we could and we would just try them, see what is going to work.
Yeah, yeah. Well, things have changed a lot, and I think it's a lot for the better. How has that happened? Do you, for example, do you teach? I know that you're associated with Wellesley College, and I think you probably had a lot of private students. What about that? What about ways of getting early music out there in the world?
My favorite kind of teaching began, I don't know, was it about 6 or 7 years ago when Kate van Orden asked me to be her assistant at Harvard.
Yep.
She dreamed up this course, I think first in Berkeley, of a hands-on history course in which students would study topics of Renaissance music and learn to play the viol. And I loved doing that course with her. And I told my colleagues at Wellesley about it. And Claire Fontijn said, let's devise our own course here. And first of all, I okayed with Kate. I said, is this a copycat? Do I have a carte blanche to do this? And she assured me I did. So Claire and I spent a whole year planning this course. And we had help in ways I never even realized that Wellesley offered help from, for example, LTS. I remember when I said, what's that? Library Technology Services. Wellesley just had so many resources for helping us create a syllabus, think of interesting ways of making assignments, and just tailoring our course to our ideas. So we spent a year doing that, and we've given that course now at least 5 years, maybe more. And it's been my favorite kind of teaching. we are using vials that were purchased at Wellesley back in the days when Owen Jander and Howard Mayer Brown were there. By the way, Tom, I'm remembering, I think my first performance at Wellesley was when you were Collegium director. I remember a concert with Julianne Baird.
Yes, yep.
Remember that? And I was playing treble viol. So anyway, just to toss out more old names.
Yeah.
So we're using viols that were purchased in those early years that, now I've been teaching at Wellesley for 30 years, but most of the time I've had one or two students, and those viols have been in cupboards, locked up in lockers. Now, since Claire and I have created this course, we have a gorgeous new classroom, and I had pegs put on the walls, and the vials stay in the classroom for everyone to see. Students go in that room and they say, "What is that? I want to play that." So we've had a very successful Music 200, and it's now required of music majors. And that's my favorite way of teaching, in the classroom, because we have 3 or 4 meetings a week. So much better than when you meet a private student once every 2 weeks or so.
Yeah.
It's just consequent, and we have the syllabus out right there. We have a concert at the end of the semester each time. And we begin by reading Stiglione, Book of the Courtier. And we begin with at the court of Isabella d'Este in Mantua. Around 1500, we talk about themes of immigration, the Franco-Flemish composers coming down where there was work in all these Italian duchies that were vying with each other to have the best music. And then Isabella herself was such a paragon. She had the best education of anyone of that time, any male noble prince.
And the most beautiful studiolo in the world, surrounded with,
yes. And, you know, I think she was actually instrumental in the development of the viola da gamba. You know, she left behind more than 16,000 letters. And when you read these letters, many of which have been translated by Diana Shemek, wonderful musicologist, and there are so many references to Isabella ordering with real specificity, very specifically, what she wanted. She wanted viols in every range of the human voice. She was a singer and she played several instruments. And she was very particular about ordering from the best luthier. And I really think that because this was the day of the fledgling viola da gamba, you know, one interesting thing I discovered was the viola da gamba originated at the same time and place as Lucrezia Borgia in Valencia in the 1470s, 80s. I mean, it's such a beautiful way of thinking about the gamba in connection with Lucrezia. So she was the sister-in-law of Isabella.
Right. And it was, well, the gamba is not as poisonous as Lucrezia Borgia was, though.
Well, I don't know. We are rehabilitating her, Tom. We're
Well,
not
it sounds like
that all of that calumny was deserved.
Yeah. It sounds like a really exciting course, and I'm jealous. I'm jealous for your students, and I'm sure everybody listening to us is too. What's going to happen to us in the future, Laura? The early music world has changed so much, as we've just been saying. There are now lots and lots of people, and an awful lot of the people in our world play at a level that was almost unimaginable when we were beginning.
Yes.
And there are lots of them. And the good news is there seems to be an audience for, well, at least sort of Baroque orchestras in many major cities in North America and around the world. Yeah. Chamber groups, I don't know. I think there probably would be young people nowadays who would say, well, it's too late for me. The record companies are all gone. All that money is gone. All the, you know, all the jobs are taken. There's nothing for me to do. What counsel would you give to an early musician nowadays?
I think they're not all saying that. I have discovered on YouTube some wonderful young performers. One of my favorites, let's see, her name is Giovanna. Let me think. I can't say the last name.
What does she play? She's a gamba player?
She's a gamba player and she sings and plays.
Ooh, I bet we can Google her. I bet we can find her.
Giovanna is her first name. And her second name begins with a B. Baviera or something. Baviera, I think. She plays her gamba on the chair, the way Emily was in the Blue Heron concert you heard. And she sings, and Douce Mémoire, you know, she plays the chords singing. Yeah. It's gorgeous. That's, you know, she makes me want to just start all over again. And then, let's see, what else have I discovered? What I love is the way they're going out of the box, these young performers. There's a beautiful jazz singer, Pia De Vita, who sings Ancor che col partire with a jazz pianist, John Taylor, with all the diminutions, and he's subtly putting in jazz chords. I love it. So I would say to young performers, keep your imaginations growing. There's so much to discover, so much new to do. I think there's a great future in early music.
There's a great future in the music of the past somehow. And it's nice to hear you say it, Laura, because you've contributed so much to the good, healthy state we're in nowadays. And I'm glad that you, at least, I think I am too, are enthusiastic and optimistic about the future, even in the middle of these rather difficult times. So we'll all be interested to see whether your predictions come true. I'm sure they will. I hope they will. And meantime, I want to thank you very, very much for this fascinating conversation. Thank you, Laura Jeppesen.
Thank you, Thomas. It's so easy to talk to you.
It's a pleasure.